Please welcome Professor Gad Lim, assessment expert and developer of the Michigan tests, who will be discussing how assessment can inform learning pathways in listening and reading.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and with all the colleagues over at Richmond. Well, hello, everyone. Again, my name is Gad Lim. I'm from Michigan Language Assessment. And in our talk today, I'd like to talk about learning pathways in listening and reading. Now, we often talk about listening and reading as if they were each just one unitary thing. But I think we all know that listening and reading, in order for us to perform these, we actually need to have a complex of different subskills in order to perform these successfully. And so what I'd like for us to cover today is to take a look at how those different subskills develop, typically among Latin American learners in listening and in reading, and see what insights we can draw from this for teaching and for assessment. So to start with, let's take a look at a cognitive model for reading, which is from Khalifa and Weir. If you take a look at this particular slide, you will see on the left side of it that when we are reading, there is actually some cognitive processing around goal setting. That is, before we read something, we decide whether we want to read to look for a particular piece of information, in which case we would just skim quickly through a text in order to find it. Or sometimes we decide that we need to read every single word of the text. So we do set our goals before we read. On the right side of the screen, you will see as part of that model that there is a knowledge base involved. That is, in order for us to be able to read, we need to have some knowledge of lexical forms and a lexicon lemma. We need to have some syntactic knowledge, and maybe some general knowledge of the world, and so on and so forth. And if you take a look at the middle of the slide, is where you see the actual reading process happening. So starting from the bottom, there is a visual input, which is the text. And when you read the text, you recognize words, you try to understand the meaning of the words, and then there's syntactic parsing where you figure out where it fits grammatically. And then you do things like inferencing, as well as building a text-level mental model, and so on and so forth. Now, the arrows in this all go upwards, but as you know, in reading, it's actually a recursive process, so they go upwards, but they also go back down. Similarly, in listening, some set of cognitive processes also happen. We see this is slightly less developed than the model for reading, but you will see that instead of lexical knowledge being the thing you start with, there is phonological knowledge. That is, when you hear something in speech, then first you need to figure out what those sounds and those phonemes are all about, decode those things in order to move on to the next stage of figuring out the meaning of words. So you can see from these cognitive models themselves that there are a number of different subskills and different knowledge bases that a person needs in order to be able to read or to listen. And these are not the only factors at the end of the day. If you think about it, when you're actually reading, or in fact assessing people when they're reading, you do need to take into account certain other things. For example, the test taker characteristics. Is the person younger or older? And you need to take into account context validity, which is to say, what are the situations within which they are doing the reading and the listening? And to what extent does that mean, what sorts of texts are you encountering? Are they narrative texts? Are they expository texts? Are they argumentative texts? What genres are they? And so on and so forth. But in today's talk, I want for us to focus primarily on cognitive validity, which is those particular subskills that we just looked at earlier, as well as the knowledge bases involved. Now, at Michigan Language Assessment, we're actually quite interested in knowing how these subskills develop, because in our tests, we don't just want to give people a final score overall, but we want to be able to help them develop these particular skills. And so I'd like to share with you some of the findings from research that is actually based on Latin American test takers who took our test, the MET, or the Michigan English test. And in order to do this research, we use this newer type of modeling called cognitive diagnostic modeling. Now, cognitive diagnostic modeling is somewhat involved and complicated, but let me try to explain to you simply how that works. So let's presume that we have a test where, let's say we have 50 items, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen, so going from 1 to 50. And let's pretend that there are 5 different subskills involved that we are testing. In reality, our tests are actually tagged for way more subskills than that, but for ease of discussion, I've collapsed it into 5 different subskills in this case. And what we do in order to do cognitive diagnostic modeling is that we tag each of the items for the subskills that are involved in it. That is to say, for item 1 in this case, someone needs to have mastered subskill 1 and 3 in order to be able to answer that item correctly. And then item 2, it involves subskills 2 and 4, and therefore somebody would need to have subskills 2 and 4 in order to be able to answer that item correctly. Now, if you do this for every single item on the test, you can then figure out, well, if somebody is at B1, let's say, we'll take a look at all the B1 people and see, well, how did they perform on the items that involve subskill number 1? How did they perform on the items involved in subskill number 2? And you can do the same thing for the person at a different CFR level. The person at B2, how did they perform on subskill 1? How did they perform on subskill 2? Now, if you do this process, you'll be able to figure out, for example, how much people at each CFR level has mastered each of the subskills. Now, in this particular case, we identified 5 particular subskills for the study. We identified them to be vocabulary, knowledge of syntax, the ability to read for detail, the ability to read for main ideas and global information, and then the ability to read for inference. Now, let me point you first to the legend at the bottom of the screen, which shows you the probability that each person at each particular level has mastered each of these subskills. So it goes from red, where somebody essentially has not mastered that subskill, all the way to a bright green, which tells you that this person has mastered that subskill. So for our presentation today, let's be on the lookout for the things that are in green, so light green and green, because if there's a 60% probability that you have mastered the subskill, then I think this person is probably we can be quite confident that this person has those particular subskills down. So let's take a look at what this looks like for reading. And I'd like for us to just look at vocabulary for now. So you will see that in reading, even at the A2 level, a learner who is at the A2 level will generally have mastered vocabulary. Now let's move on to reading, to listening. If we look at listening, the picture is slightly different. At A2 level, that learner has not yet mastered vocabulary. And indeed, even at B1, it's still on the cusp. And it's really at the B2 level that they have mastered listening. So we find out from this that learners display mastery of vocabulary in reading earlier than in listening. Now, I don't know whether this particular piece of information is earth-shattering for you or not. I suspect for many of you, this does not come as a surprise. And if you had to come up with a reason, you might come up with something like this. Now, we all know that in reading, the text involved is actually printed on the page, and therefore there is plenty of time for somebody to pay attention to the vocabulary fact, if they were somewhat weak, they still have the time to figure it out, perhaps using the words surrounding it, the context, and so on and so forth. Now, when we're listening, it's slightly different because when you listen, the audio stream goes into your ear and then it's no more. And therefore, being able to review vocabulary becomes somewhat more challenging. And if someone is at a lower level of ability in a particular language, then they will not have the automaticity in order to be able to listen to the entire audio stream. As they're trying to figure out a particular word, the audio stream continues and things would have passed them by. And we all know that really the nature of expertise is about automaticity. And if you're not yet an expert, you have to use your short-term memory to process things. And we know that our short-term memory is limited. And therefore, what's happening is short-term memory gets in the way. And by the time you figure things out, things have moved on. In fact, here, for example, are the findings of a study done in 2000 about the listening comprehension problems reported by English language learners. Now, you will see that the ones that they report include things like do not recognize words that they know. That is, they might have read the words before, but they've never actually heard it read out loud to them in aural terms. And therefore, it took them some time to figure out, oh, what I just heard actually relates to this particular word. You can see the lack of expertise there. Neglecting the next part when thinking about the meaning. I think this is what I was saying about the lack of automaticity. While they're busy thinking about the word, about what they're hearing, the next part has moved on. And they sometimes quickly forget what is heard, and sometimes they understand words but not the intended message. So in many ways, it really is no surprise that mastery of vocabulary is achieved at an earlier level, and mastery of vocabulary and listening happens at a later level. So we find out from this particular study that reading, you can master it probably at A2, and in listening, probably at B2. Now let's move on and take a look quickly at these other subskills. And I'm not going to go into them in detail right now, but I do want you to make a note at the back of your head, the difference between them. Okay, so if we take a look at syntax, we can see that in reading, it's at B2 that this is mastered, whereas in listening, it's roughly at the same level. But you can see that in reading, at B1, they really just don't have it yet, whereas in listening at B1, they're already getting there. So syntax is mastered in listening earlier than in reading. In detail, let's take a look. For reading, at B2, you will have mastered reading for detail. But as far as listening goes, even at C1, the circle is not yet the dark green. So in reading or listening for detail, mastery in listening develops later than in reading. And for global, well, we'll see. Global, you master it at C1. And in listening, you master it at B2. So for reading or listening for global information, listening mastery develops earlier than mastery in reading. And finally, if we take a look at inference, for reading and for listening, they develop at roughly the same pace. Okay, so again, syntax, mastery in listening earlier than in reading, detail, mastery in listening later than in reading, and global, mastery in listening earlier than in reading. Now, I want to stop right there because we've been taking a look and comparing listening and reading. And what I'd like us to think about for now is, if you're taking a look, for example, at listening in C1, and you see that, people have achieved that bright green in vocabulary, syntax, global, and inference, but not yet in detail, it might make you think, does mastery of one subskill depend on mastery of another subskill? That is to say, for example, do you need to have mastered vocabulary in order to be able to master listening for detail. Now, this is actually something that we were also able to study in cognitive diagnostic modeling. And let me explain how that happens. So here you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen, certain patterns of mastery or lack thereof. And over, you can see that there are the 5 subskills up top. So let's pretend that in this particular assessment data, that we only observe these 5 patterns. Let's say that there are some test takers who showed us evidence of having pattern number 1. That is, they haven't mastered any of the subskills. And pattern 5 is a group of students who showed that they have mastered every single one of the subskills. And then 2 to 4 show us students who have mastered, some combination of subskills, but not others. Now let's take a look at subskill number 5. We can see that subskill number 5 is mastered by people who reflect patterns number 4 and 5. And we will see that anyone who has mastered subskill number 5 appears to also have mastered subskill number 1 and subskill number 4. Can you see that? Anyone with a green check mark for subskill number 5 also has a green check mark for skills number 1 and 4. So we might think, there might be a relationship among subskills 1, 4, and 5. Is it possible that subskill 5 is necessary for developing mastery in subskill 1? The answer is no, because we see in pattern number 2 that there are people who did not master subskill 5 who are able to master subskill number 1. Do you see that? But on the other hand, we can see that every time that somebody has mastered subskill 5, they've also mastered subskills 1 and 4. Now let's take a look again at patterns 2 and 3. We can see that in pattern 2, that somebody who has mastered subskill number 1 did not necessarily master subskill number 4. And in pattern number 3, somebody who has mastered subskill 4 has not mastered subskill 1. What does that tell you? That tells you that subskill 1 or mastery in subskill 1 does not depend on mastery in subskill 4 and vice versa. What that tells us, therefore, is that where subskill 5 is concerned, subskill 1 and 4, while they don't depend on one another, might be the skills that are necessary in order to develop mastery of subskill 5. All right? Now, I just said it's possible because in this case, all that we've seen is that mastery of 1 and 4 happened before 5. But we need to be careful. Just because one thing has followed another does not necessarily mean that the one that came before caused the thing that came after, right? For example, let's say in our data, we saw that people all learned Spanish first and then later on learned English. Does that mean that if you'd never learned Spanish, you'd never learn English? Well, that's clearly not true because there are plenty of people here in the United States, where I am, who actually learn English who have never spoken Spanish. So in this case, you might have seen an order of people learning Spanish before they learn English, and maybe all that reflects is that the data came from Latin America, where you are, where everyone learned Spanish first before learning English. So the order does not mean that there is causation. So we need to have a good explanation or a good theory. But let's take a look at a second example. Let's say we observe that everyone in the study showed mastery in holding a pencil first, and then later on showed mastery in playing tennis. Now here it's kind of weird because, what do pencils have to do with tennis? But I think we can figure out that actually what we're dealing with is not holding pencil per se, but the ability to grip a cylindrical object. And if you don't have the capability to hold a cylindrical object, then perhaps you won't have the ability to hold a tennis racket, and therefore you're not able to play tennis. So here we can see that we have observed holding a pencil happening before playing tennis, and we've refined our construct to say actually what we care about is gripping cylindrical objects, and we can say that indeed there is an order of acquisition going on here. First, you need to be able to grip a cylindrical object, and then you can play tennis. Okay? Now let's move on from tennis, because I think in Latin America you care more about football. So let's actually take a look at what the pathways are for listening and reading that we saw in our study. So here's what we actually found out from doing that analysis that I just walked you through earlier. What we found out was that in reading, vocabulary, detail, and syntax do not actually depend on one another. You can develop mastery in vocabulary independently of developing mastery in detail and independently of developing mastery in syntax. But the data shows that you need to develop mastery in these three in order to be able to demonstrate mastery in reading for global information and in reading for inference. Now let's take a look at listening. Listening is quite different. In listening, you develop mastery in vocabulary, and this is necessary in order for you to develop mastery in listening. This is necessary for you to develop mastery in listening for inference and in listening for global information. And further, it's listening for having the vocabulary to listen for global information is necessary in order for you to develop mastery in listening for detail. Quite different from reading. And you will see that syntax kind of sits in its own corner there in the playground with nobody wanting to play with it. Okay? So let's think about syntax. Syntax matters in reading for developing mastery in reading for global information and inference. But in listening, it just kind of sits by itself. We need a good theory so that we know that these pathways that we're showing here actually have a validity to them. And I think we can come up with a good explanation for why syntax, does not really matter as much in listening. And I suppose it's because all of us kind of know that syntax in spoken language tends to be simpler than syntax in written language. Okay? And to just look at it very quickly in a particular way, let's think about the use of connectors in spoken language and in written language. I'm going to show you the connectors that we use most frequently in spoken language and in written language. In spoken language, the single connector that we use the most is the word so. We use it about 50 times for every 10,000 words we speak, and then comes afterwards, which occurs about 35 times for every 10,000 words we speak. Now, for writing, the most frequently occurring connector is however. But you can see that even though this is the most frequently occurring connector in writing, it only shows up about 14 times for every 10,000 words, which is quite far away from those frequently occurring connectors in spoken language. So it tells you that when we're speaking, quite often, really all we're dealing with is, so this, then that, so this, then that, and so on and so forth. Now let's think about these connectors and what we're actually having to do mentally and cognitively when we're using them. When you're using connectors like so and then, it tells us that there's a sequence. This led to this, then this, which basically tells you that once you moved on to the next thing, you don't really need to keep at the back of your head the thing before it, because you've already followed the train of thought, and you know that the next thing that comes, so this, then that, and therefore you can feel free to just forget about the previous thing. But however is different. However tells us that we have a piece of information, however, something else. Cognitively, what that's telling us is you need to hold on to this earlier piece of information because you're going to need to contrast it with this later piece of information later on. So you can see cognitively, it requires more resources in order to be able to do syntax in written text, right? And remember, earlier we noted that mastery of syntax happens earlier in listening than in reading. And if you think about what we've just said, well, that makes perfect sense because syntax in spoken language is simpler, and therefore it's easier to go out and develop mastery in it. Whereas in written text, it tends to be more complex, and therefore developing mastery in it tends to come somewhat later on. Okay? Now let's move on to thinking about reading for detail, or reading and listening for detail, as well as for global information. Now, again, you will see here that for reading, you need to have developed mastery in reading for detail in order to develop mastery in reading for global information. Whereas for listening, it's actually the other way around. You actually develop mastery in listening for global information before you're able to develop mastery in listening for detail. And indeed, as we saw, even at the C1 level, people have not completely mastered listening for detail yet. Now, could we make sense of this? Why is it that global and detail are switched in reading and in listening? Now, let's think about one particular feature of spoken language and written language. And this is the notion of branching. And in spoken language, we actually know that branching is typically right branching, which is to say that the main idea comes to the left or at the beginning, and then we expand what we're saying to the right. And so I have an example here, a very bad example because it's the one I came up with. Maria is truly an outstanding woman, a parent of 3 fine children, a pioneer in her field, and a pillar of the community, right? So here we know that the main idea is Maria is truly an outstanding woman, and everything else that follows are just extra information that expands on this main idea. But writing is different. Writing is left branching. And so to use my horrible information example, a parent to 3 fine children, a pioneer in her field, and a pillar of the community, Maria is truly an outstanding woman. Now, if you don't like my example, and if it doesn't feel like that's very different from the right branching sentence, you can instead take a look at this wonderful example from Martin Luther King, where he wrote in his letters from Birmingham jail. It's about 300 words. It's all one sentence, and the main idea comes right at the very end. You have to read about 300 words before you get to the main idea. Now think about what this implies cognitively. In listening, you're dealing with a spoken text, and you hear first, Maria is truly an outstanding woman. What did you hear first? It's actually the main idea. It's the global information. And if you have that to hang on to, then you can move on to think, oh yeah, she is an outstanding woman because, her children are great. She's a pioneer in her field, and she's a pillar of the community. Those are the details that you can pick up. Or if you don't pick them up, it doesn't, in a sense, matter because you still got the main idea already. But that's kind of different from reading. In reading, you have to read, a parent to 3 fine children. Okay, I don't know what to do with that yet. A pioneer in her field. Okay, I think I also need to keep this at the back of my mind because I don't know what to do with this yet. And a pillar of the community. I still don't know what I need to do with these. Maria is truly an outstanding woman. I've collected all these details, and now finally at the end of the sentence, I know why these details are being given to me. It's in order to be able to tell me this main idea that Maria is truly an outstanding woman. And so it kind of makes sense. In reading, you pick up all the details, and because of that, you're able to read for global information. If you're not, then some things get lost along the way. Whereas in listening, you actually get the main idea first, the global information, and it's after that that the details come. So you can see, what did we say earlier about listening and reading? Which one comes first for the ability to develop a mastery in listening or reading for detail? Remember, it's in listening, you develop mastery of detail later than in reading. And that makes sense. And for global, you develop mastery of it in listening earlier than in reading. And again, that makes sense. Because in spoken language, we actually lead with the main information, the global information. Whereas in reading, we often actually don't do that. Now, I invite you to think about some of the other relationships that we found in this study. For example, that in reading, vocabulary and detail, one doesn't depend on the other. You can figure out why that might be the case. Or in the case of listening, why is it that inference only depends on vocabulary, but not on mastery of global listening and listening for detail? But I think what we have presented here gives us some good theoretical reasons that the pathways that we have observed are actually valid and reflect something that is real. Now, if you are convinced by this, let me offer to you some possible applications that come out of this particular research. The first thing is to just say, where you know the level of the course that you are teaching or of the student that you are teaching, then you can use the information from this study to inform planning for teaching and assessment. You will know that, if they're at, let's say at the B2 level, well, they probably already have mastered these things. And so I'll just move on and focus on those things that I know they would not have mastered yet. Or for example, in assessment. Now, we often actually have assessment that we use for a range of purposes. And I've listed 3 different purposes here. For example, for diagnosis at the beginning of a term in order to find out where your students are at. We could have assessment for learning in the course of our instruction. And we can also have achievement testing to find out at the end of the course what they have learned. Now, let's think about listening for detail, for example. Now, we noted that at the C1 level, people haven't necessarily developed full mastery of listening for detail. So let's say that your course is about teaching listening to people who are at the B2 level. Now, if this is the case, if you're doing achievement testing at the end of the course, how many items related to listening for detail will you include? Do you include none, very few, or many? Think about it for a minute. Well, I think if you think about it a bit, you'll say that you already know that at B2 level, they're not likely to have mastered listening for detail. So if you put in a lot of items that are just about listening for detail, then that's probably a bad idea, because all you're trying to help the students know is that they don't know enough about that. So if it's an achievement test, then you probably do not want to include a lot of listening for detail items for B2 level learners. On the other hand, if it's assessment for learning, where you're trying to use this to improve instruction, then it's actually probably not a bad idea to include items about listening for detail, because this is the place where you can actually help them develop those skills. If you never include any of those items, then you wouldn't know whether they are starting to develop those skills or not. And finally, if you're doing assessment for diagnostic purposes, well, at the beginning of the course, you might not know whether all your students are really at, B2 or a pre-B2. For all you know, they might be at a wide range of levels. So it might be a good idea to include items that cover a wide range. So you can see that with the information we have, we can use that to inform planning for teaching and assessment. And we can think about, different forms of assessment and how, therefore, that would impact how much of each type of item we include. Now, one other application is that it's not a bad idea to be aware of these mastery pathways, the dependencies, and so that we can order our instruction accordingly. If, for example, in listening, vocabulary is the bedrock on which you build everything, it probably is not as smart to focus on teaching them listening for details if you know that their skills in vocabulary, their vocabulary knowledge base is still relatively underdeveloped. So you might want to focus on that first before working on other things. Okay. But here I want to add a little caveat and a little asterisk, which is that there is this thing called compensating or compensation. Now, I told you that we use a modeling technique called cognitive diagnostic modeling. And in fact, there are a variety of cognitive diagnostic models involved, some of which are compensatory models and some of which are not. And in plain English, all I want to say is that our research showed that in language learning, for these particular subskills, the compensatory models actually worked out better, which is to say, the evidence indicates that you might be able to use your strengths in some subskills to help you compensate for weaknesses in other subskills. And in fact, we found out, this is some preliminary information. We also did the same sort of analysis for another test of ours called MET Go, which is focused on a slightly lower level of ability. So the MET Go focuses on levels A1 to B1. And we did the same sort of analysis. And at the moment, what it's looking like? There are no dependencies. So reading and listening, you saw here that in listening, for example, that you need to master vocabulary to master reading for listening for global information in order to master listening for detail. In that other study at the lower levels, there was nothing. And that, in a sense, is not a surprise because, as I pointed out at the beginning, the things that matter is not just the cognitive things, but also contextual things. The texts are simpler at the lower level, and therefore it's easier to use skills in one particular subskill to make up for weaknesses in the others. So it's something you want to think about and take into account. If you're working with learners at the low level, A1 or A2, then you can probably spread out your instruction across all these different subskills because each one of them can help them with their listening and reading. But as you're moving up to B1 and B2 and C1, then you have to know that there are certain subskills that they're not going to be able to master unless they have mastered the earlier, more elemental subskill involved. Finally, one more application is in your teaching, do account for differences between modalities, in this case, listening and reading. Now, I will confess, when I was a language teacher, it was many, many years ago, where resources were not as plentiful because we did not have the internet and so on. When you taught listening, you kind of need to bring your boombox into the room, and it was just too much effort. And I will confess that I think, just use reading as the default and use that as a template for my teaching in listening. And therefore, I probably assume that I'm going to help my students learn to read for detail and listen for detail before teaching them listening for inference and reading for inference. But as I can see from this research now, that my teaching and listening probably wasn't very successful because, in fact, unless you develop mastery in listening for global information, it'll be very hard to develop that mastery in listening for detail. So do be aware of the differences between listening and reading, and then teach each skill accordingly. If you're just responsible for teaching one skill and not the two, then life is easier. If you're teaching both reading and listening, then you'll have to figure out how you go about teaching each one. This really is all I have to say. So what I'm going to do now is to just flash on the screen for you one more time the tables and the figures that I showed you, so that if you wanted to take a quick screen cap or a picture of it, you can do so that at your own pace, in your own time, you'll be able to reflect more on the information contained in them. So here is the rate at the levels at which people develop mastery in vocabulary, syntax, detail, global reading, reading for inference. In this slide, which is for listening, you can see how people develop mastery in vocabulary, syntax, detail, listening for global information, listening for inference. And in this slide, we see the pathways and the dependencies. For reading, again, vocabulary, detail, and syntax, each do not depend on any of the rest for you to develop mastery in them. But mastery in vocabulary, detail, and syntax is necessary for developing mastery in reading for global information and reading for inference. And finally, in listening, syntax sits by itself because syntax is more straightforward in listening, and this is true even in academic contexts. But vocabulary is the bedrock that is necessary for developing mastery in listening for inference, listening for global information, and mastery in listening for global information is necessary for developing mastery in listening for detail. I hope this session has been interesting for you. If you have any questions, do feel free to get in touch. But thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Lim, for a very inspiring session. We now invite you all to go back to the auditorium for today's closing plenary.